Welcome back. Got a nice afternoon as well as a morning. And the speaker today is Ralph. The speaker today is Ralph Buglass. And he is a product of the Montgomery County Schools, so he knows a little bit of whereof he speaks. And he, pardon? A little bit, a lot. But I think it's important to note that he came to this because he was a volunteer at Kingsley one-room schoolhouse in Little Bennett State Park, or park up in Hyattstown in Clarksburg. And just got interested in the topic, volunteers there, still volunteers there, and won a national award last year recognizing his volunteerism. So he's been pursuing the topic, and I think you're going to enjoy it. And his biography is in your packet as well. Also want to say that this session is sponsored by the Mary Kay Harper Center for Suburban Studies, which is an initiative of the Montgomery County Historical Society to bring us into the 20th century and understand that the way that suburbanization has changed it into the county that we have now. So without further ado, Ralph.
When you signed up for the conference, you probably signed up to hear about courthouses at this session. 4 courthouses. The speaker was ill, but she's much better now. But she was not able to give this presentation. I hope you won't feel shortchanged because instead of 4 courthouses, we're going to talk about a lot more schoolhouses. And unlike in court, where the lawyers jump in with a lot of questions, please hold your questions to the end because we have a lot of schoolhouses to go over. One-room schoolhouse really has an iconic place in American history. It's the very symbol of early public education in our country. But as late as 1913, just over 100 years ago, 1/2 of all American kids were still being educated in one-room schoolhouses, and I don't know for sure, but just from what we go through, I think that pretty much holds true here in Montgomery County. I also talk about 2-room schoolhouses for 2 reasons. A lot of these one-room schoolhouses were added onto with an additional room, but more importantly, by talking about 2-room schoolhouses, I can touch upon Rosenwald schools, which were an important but I think too little known chapter in the story of education of African American children. So we're focusing on schoolhouses that are still standing, surviving today, but I have to add a caveat, sort of still standing. Because while we have a lot of really fine examples right here in Montgomery County, some are barely standing. And really the bulk of them have been converted to a variety of other uses, as you'll see. I put together this map of all the schoolhouses, 1- and 2-room schoolhouses still standing in Montgomery County. That's a lot to take in. The point for right now is that there are 28, at least 28, still standing all over the county. An absolutely astounding number, I think, because as Eileen mentioned, we're a highly developed suburban county, and yet we still have 28 of these so-called relics. Let's start with 5 that have been nicely restored as school museums today to reflect their early use. The oldest one is in Seneca. Many of you probably know it. The Seneca Stone Schoolhouse out on River Road near Poolsville. This school actually predates public education in Montgomery County. Of course, the red Seneca sandstone was what was used to build the Smithsonian Castle downtown, and you'll see it in a lot of other buildings all over the area. Predates public education. The new Constitution of 1864 that we heard about this morning that emancipated the slaves Article 8 of that finally set up a system of free public education in Maryland. At that time, Maryland was one of the last states to institute free public education. So Seneca had been built a little before that, and actually there had been some attempts to start public education in the early 60s, but it didn't really get going because of the Civil War until 1864 with that new state constitution. Seneca was built by a community leader, and parents had to pay either money, materials, or services to have their kids attend there. It was later incorporated into the new Montgomery County public school system, and today has been restored outside and in by the Preservation Group Historic Medley District. Generally, one-room schoolhouses had grades 1 through 7, all in one room with one teacher. How could one teacher do it? Well, the kids sat by age so that the teacher could move through the classroom, working first with one grade while the other kids were maybe practicing penmanship, writing an essay, reading a chapter in a book, doing some arithmetic problems. You probably recognize those as the 3 R's, reading, writing, arithmetic. Very basic education, but I like to say there were 3 other R's that were important. One was respect. Moral education and good conduct was very important. Recitation was a big deal in one-room schoolhouses. Kids actually had to memorize a lot of things and then recite them back. And it was all backed up with the 3rd R, the rod. There was corporal punishment. This photograph is a beautiful photograph taken by Dan Potter, who I invited today, a photographer who specializes in taking photos of one-room schools, and many of the photos that you saw at the beginning there are his work, and I'll have a few more coming up. This is not one of his photos, obviously. This is a historical photo of one of the classes at Seneca. At first I thought this was the teacher. The teacher is more obscured here in front of the door. This rather older young woman indicates that although it was grades 1 through 7, you could have kids much older still attending these schools. Again, a couple of reasons. Remember, Montgomery County was rural, agricultural. Kids were needed to help out on the farms, especially in spring and fall, and so they might take longer than a year to finish up a grade. In addition, 7th grade education was really the standard. The first high school in Montgomery County came about in 1892. That was in Rockville, so if you wanted to go on to high school, you had to find a way to get to Rockville every day, which was, of course, not easy. That's our first one. Next, in Brookville, a quintessential wooden frame structure. Restored in the late 1990s, early 2000s by the town of Brookville, and is an absolutely gorgeous structure, as this gorgeous photograph of Dan's shows. Next, Kingsley. As Eileen mentioned, I'm a tour guide there. This one is near and dear to my heart. Sits in an absolutely gorgeous setting in the middle of Little Bennett Park. You have to walk there just like kids did back in the day. The nearest parking lot is about a half-mile away, but it's worth it. This one was built a little later on, 1893, continued in use until 1935, became a part of the growing Little Bennett Park beginning in the late 1960s. Suffered a lot of vandalism in the 70s, so for the most part sat boarded up behind a fence. Within the last few years, the parks have been able to restore it with the help of the Clarksburg Historical Society. The society has contributed a lot of the period pieces inside. You see there a small slate board. I try to tell the kids who visit today that that's an early computer, almost looks like a computer screen. They don't entirely buy it, but I say, you know, you can compute 2 plus 2 equals 4. You have to use your head. You also have to use your head with our spell checker, an old, big old dictionary. Kingsley had the latest in central heating, wood stove. If the kids were lucky, on top of the wood stove, the teacher might have a kettle of soup simmering away all winter morning so that they could have a hot lunch in addition to what they brought. The 48-star flag and the Pledge of Allegiance was a little different then. I pledge allegiance to my flag. It was changed to the flag of the United States of America in the 1920s when there was a wave of immigration and concern that the immigrants were not being fully assimilated as American citizens. Next, at the other end of Clarksburg Road is Boyd's. Thus far, we've been talking about schools for white children. The 1864 Constitution that we heard about that freed the slaves made no provision for educating the children of the newly emancipated people. That did not come about until 1872, 8 years later. Free public education for black students. But then, of course, it was separate schools. Boyd's Negro School, as it was called, was one of these schools, nicely restored by the Boyd's Historical Society. About the same time period as Kingsley, and about the same size, but there the similarities end. Generally, the number of students in the black schools, far many more than in the white schools. For the privilege of teaching more students, the black teachers, always black teachers, never a white teacher in the black schools. The teachers were paid about half as much. The desks, the books were all hand-me-downs, worn out from the white schools. The schools for African Americans were even on a separate budget, so that never enough money. They would typically close early in the year, in the school year, sometimes even as early as February. There's one way in which the white and black schools were the same. No running water, no electricity. The outhouse still exists at Boyd's. Not that you'd want to use it. Across the street from Boyd's is the Edward U. Taylor School. Obviously not a 1 or 2 room school. No longer being used as a school. This was built in the early 1950s. One of 4 schools built in the early 1950s to be consolidated schools for African American students all around the county. In 1954, of course, the Supreme Court in the landmark case Brown versus Board of Education ruled that separate schools were unconstitutional. Montgomery County had these 4 modern schools. This is the only one that became an integrated mainstream school. 2 of the others were converted to special needs schools. One in Sandy Spring was converted to a community center and still serves that purpose today. The next of the 5 schools that have been restored is Smithville. This is located on Randolph Road, just east of New Hampshire Avenue. Also a school for black kids, a 2-room school. Most importantly, this was a Rosenwald school. Julius Rosenwald was the president of Sears Roebuck in the early 1900s. That was the heyday of the Sears catalog business. He was very wealthy, wanted to use his wealth for good purposes, struck up a friendship with Booker T. Washington of Tuskegee Institute for Blacks. Booker T. Washington was a strong advocate of education, and Rosenwald set up a fund to build public schools for African American students all over the South. Altogether, just under 5,000 of these schools, as I say, all across the South, extending up into Maryland. 159 Rosenwald schools were built in Maryland. In Montgomery County, 15 Rosenwald schools, all of them built in the 1920s. Smithville was one of these, and really was a very typical looking Rosenwald school. The building on the right is the one that has been restored today by members of Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity, many of whom actually attended Smithville. The other building has not been restored. A sign on the front of it indicates what happened to this building. Division of Highway Maintenance. It became a garage, but today has been restored, as I said, and inside some wonderful exhibits about its time as a Rosenwald school. Typically it's open during Heritage Montgomery Days, the last weekend in June, and when I visited it last June, a former student also visited and was absolutely delighted to see her picture as a child among the exhibits. So those are what I call the big five of surviving schools. 3 were for white children, 2 were for black children. In addition, there are 6 other surviving schools for African American students. The oldest is Mount Zion in Laytonsville. Here it is today. Here's the original one-room portion. View from the other side, you see it stands right next to Mount Zion Church. That's significant. Mount Zion, then AME Church, African American Episcopal, actually built this school before 1872, when I said public education was finally instituted for African American children. I should say that I should note that when that school later became part of the Montgomery County school system, and when it was closed and the schools went to sell it back to the church, it was discovered that there was no deed for the property. That's not terribly surprising. The black communities and black residents often donated land in order to get schools built for their children. The next one is out in Martinsburg. Eileen talked about this a little bit this morning. As I indicated, the churches were the pillar of black communities that sprang up after the Civil War, and that was definitely the case here in Martinsburg. You see the church there, where school actually started inside the church before a building was built next door. Between these two buildings in the background there, you can see the Loving Charity Hall. This was a benevolent association that Eileen mentioned. Benevolent associations, fairly typical in the new black communities. They provided services that weren't available to black citizens in the community at large. Things like insurance, or just a gathering place for the community. This is one of the few sites in Montgomery, in all of Maryland, that still has these 3 very important institutions: the church, the school, and a benevolent society building. Next, Quince Orchard School. Today it's on what's called the Pleasant View Historical Society, historical site. A 2-room school. It started out as a 1-room school. In fact, the school was an abandoned white school that was moved to this site after the original black school burned down. So in addition to hand-me-down books, you had hand-me-down schools. The second classroom was added onto with the help of Rosenwald funding. So it's another Rosenwald school in the county, and sits right next to the Black Community Church. In Norbeck today, this was it back in the day. Again, a very typical looking Rosenwald school. Here is Smithville for comparison. Identical, in fact. Rosenwald schools were built according to detailed architectural plans that the Rosenwald Fund had drawn up, frankly, to make sure that these schools were built to high standards. Here it is today. It's a community center. Bring back the historical photograph. You can see it's virtually the same building except for the windows. And a wonderfully very nice looking church right next door. Kengar, on the border of Kensington and Garrett Park. A slightly different looking Rosenwald school. Here it is today. But again, basically the same building. You see sort of a step-up structure here going up the hillside. I think you can make out the chimney there and maybe the patch in the roof where the chimney was. But it's the same building, practically an appendage to the church next door. Poolsville, this one you would never know. Here it is today, another garage. But if you go around back, there are the telltale Rosenwald windows. Very nearby is the Jerusalem Baptist Church, and in the cemetery there is buried Noah Clark. You can't talk about education of African American students in Montgomery County without paying homage, I think, to Noah Clark. He spearheaded efforts, along with others, to finally have a high school for African American students built. This was the Rockville Colored High School, as it was called. Built finally in 1927 with Rosenwald funding. 1927 was 55 years after 1972, the year that free public education was instituted for African American students. This was also 35 years after the first high school for white children was built. As it was in 1927, there were 10 high schools for white students scattered around the county. For black children to get a post-secondary education and possibly that all-important high school diploma, they had to come from sometimes quite far away to that school in Rockville. It no longer exists, but the site is designated with a sign in downtown Rockville. That school became overcrowded right away. In 1935, this school was built to replace it. Lincoln High School still stands in Lincoln Park. This actually was also a former wooden white school, moved to Lincoln Park in bits and pieces and then covered with brick. It became overcrowded quite quickly, and after World War II it got an addition. Quonset huts, leftover Quonset huts, installed in the back. I can assure you there are a lot of portables at elementary schools today, but there were no Quonset huts at any of the white schools at that time. In the early 1950s, same time that those 4 modern elementary schools for African American children were built, finally a modern high school was built. George Washington Carver High School, also in Rockville. After the Brown decision, there was very little consideration of this being used as an integrated school. It became the offices for the county school system and is still used for that purpose today. I should say that inside this building is a very nicely done exhibit about the history of segregated schools in Montgomery County. And you can pick up a booklet there. Montgomery County schools were officially desegregated by 1961. That's 7 years after the Brown decision. That was sooner than some of the initial proposals, which were to integrate 1 grade per year, and then maybe even take a year off to study how it went. Montgomery County was also integrated or desegregated its schools. I'm not sure I want to use integrated. Desegregated its schools sooner than a lot of other counties in Maryland. In Prince George's County, it wasn't until 1973 that the schools were considered desegregated, and that was as a result of busing. I've spent a lot of time on this, but the sign in front of the Smithville School, I think, says why. That which was designed to separate us will unite us. So those are the 8 schools for African American students still standing. We included Boyd's and Smithville among the big 5, so we're up to 11. New category, 1 and 2 room schoolhouses that have been converted to residences. These are the bulk of the schools. There are 10 of them all around the county. I was just driving down White's Ferry Road, east of Poolsville, almost at the intersection with Route 28, and I saw this modest-looking home and thought, that could almost be a 1-room schoolhouse. Started doing some research, and indeed, this was the old Dawsonville School. That's what got me going on this. At the end of Goshen School Road is the old Goshen School, another modest house, flanked by 2 very large oak trees. I like to think that those trees were planted in an Arbor Day ceremony. Arbor Day ceremonies were big deals in 1-room school days. Dear little tree that we plant today, what will you be when we're old and gray? My leaves shall whisper a tale of the children who planted me. Well, maybe in a way we're telling that story. And nearby, Cedar Heights looks a little more like a house, but side view, you see 3 equally spaced windows on the side. That's another telltale sign of an old 1-room school. Down county in Fairland, the old Fairland 1-room school. Here's the 1-room portion. An addition was added to make it a house. Again, the side view, you see the 3 equally spaced windows, one of which has been taken out, but perhaps you see the flagpole still exists out in front. This school was bought when it was no longer used as a school and put up for auction. It was bought by a former student, and her family still lives there today. One thing to note about this house and 1-room schools generally, 8 feet is the height of a typical residential story, and I've marked it there. 1-room schoolhouses were generally 12 feet high, and you'll see that in a few of the others coming up. Some of the 2-room schools, way up in Hyattstown. Here is the old Hyattstown 2-room school. This is the best historical photograph I was able to find. It's not very good. It's hard to tell how the school might have been configured, but again, you see the 12-foot height of the building. A little easier to tell is the old 2-room Barnesville School, and you see that the house pretty much still retains the original shape. Down in Wheaton, we're talking about a suburban county. Wheaton is as densely populated and redeveloped as you can get, but still exists. There is the Wheaton brick two-room school. Hard to tell, but around on either side, a bank of large windows to provide light inside to the rooms that were right next to each other. Let me back up here on Wheaton for just a minute. Almost right next door to the Wheaton two-room school here was the Wheaton Colored School. It no longer exists, but very rarely were white schools and colored schools so close to each other. Next, in Chevy Chase, this very elegant house on Bradley Lane started life as a two-room school. Here they are together. You can see some of the same features, the pillars, the porch, the two chimneys, a bank of nice windows on the side from the old blueprints. This school is interesting in that this gets us into the days of Montgomery County as a suburb. This school was built by the developers of Chevy Chase when it was being created as one of the first Maryland suburbs. And the builders thought, like is the case today, schools also sell houses. So they built this school, donated the land that it was on to the county. The county had to pay the construction costs. The only thing was that at the time, this was built in 1898. At that time, just the DC line was really not a barrier for education. Maryland residents could attend schools in DC, and DC schools were a very well-developed, advanced system. Here's the school just over the line in DC that most of the parents ended up sending their kids to from Chevy Chase, Maryland. So much so that the Chevy Chase Maryland school closed for under-enrollment in just 5 years at a $500 loss to the county. Along about 1910, DC started charging tuition for Maryland residents to attend, and a year or so later, an act of Congress prevented Maryland residents from attending DC schools at all. Just sort of as a point of reference about DC schools, in 1872, this was one of the first schools built for African American children in DC. DC schools were also segregated, but 1872, you may remember, was the year that Maryland finally instituted public education for African American kids. Since the theme here is still standing, this building still stands. It's at 17th and M Street downtown, and it serves as the museum and archives for the DC public schools. Back to our schools that are now residences. Seneca Mills School, very near the original Seneca School, a grand house, but at the far left end is the original one-room Seneca Mills School. It was a wooden building, as this picture shows. This picture is in a wonderful book of photographs by Margaret Coleman. I was looking through that book just to refresh my memory for this presentation and read the caption for the first time, which noted that this student bought the building after it was no longer used as a school and converted it into a house. And I was just tracking it down about this time a week ago. Otherwise, I was up to 27. Now we have 28. Last house, again, a school, an old one-room school that's now part of a larger house. You can see it there behind the screen porch. This was the Garrett Park School. So those are our 10 that are alive today because people are living in them. You will recall we were up to 11. We're now up to 21. We're closing in. 3 of these two-room schools, coincidentally, are still being used today as preschools, somewhat in line with their original purpose. Just up the road from the Garrett Park one-room school is the Garrett Park two-room school, a very handsome brick two-room building built in 1928. Still sits right next to the very modern Garrett Park Elementary School that was rebuilt just a couple years ago. Probably has 20 rooms with a library, cafeteria, resource rooms of all sorts. Just up the road a bit is the Montrose two-room school that probably many of you know, a stucco building right on Montrose Road. Two-room school built in 1909, and this one has the distinction perhaps of being used the longest of any of these. This was still a school as late as 1966, a special needs school. It was then closed and threatened with demolition. This one was built in 1909 to replace a one-room school. And that one-room school at the time was called a disgrace to the county and a menace to the health of the teacher and the children alike. So this was the replacement for that other apparently awful one-room school. This one itself was threatened with demolition after it was closed and saved by Peerless Rockville, which also saved the old red brick courthouse. So if you came to hear about courthouses, you got a little bit. Up in Clarksburg, almost a twin of the Montrose School, except it was a wood frame building. It sits right next to the modern Clarksburg Elementary School and is, as I said, used as a preschool. This photograph was taken by Cam Miller, who also has a wonderful website of photographs. These mainly in Upper Montgomery County and Lower Frederick County, including a lot of historical sites in that area. So a historical photo of Clarksburg two-room schoolhouse and its virtual twin, Montrose. These two buildings are on the National Register of Historic Places, as is the old Seneca School building. These are the three in Montgomery County that have been so designated. One other two-room school to squeeze in here, Burtonsville, a little different design than all the others. It's today being used by a church. It's in very bad condition and has an ugly, has an addition next to it, but it's still standing. So the three preschools plus that one that's been converted to another use, 4 more. We were up to 21, now 25. The last 3. These are the sorta still standing. The schools in ruins, all on the western edge of the county. First Pools Tract, I love that name, sounds so rural, and indeed, this was the one that I showed at the beginning of the presentation. It was originally a one-room school, second room added on. When it closed, it was bought by a farmer and was used mostly as a farm shed, and that has taken a toll on it. Nearby, if you go down Elmer School Road and know where to look, because virtually hidden by the undergrowth is the falling down Elmer School. I went there after a snowstorm in hopes that it might be a little more apparent, and indeed you can see a window there next to a door, and this old photograph shows that. This photograph, by the way, came from the now defunct Maryland News, which in 1928 had photographs of a lot of these schools to showcase the schools. Perhaps needless to say, there was not a single school for African Americans included in this edition. A second view of Elmer, the side view, again falling down on itself, but you see some metal here. What's that about? The records show that Elmer had metal wainscoting inside. Wainscoting is that portion, lower portion of the interior wall. Here at Kingsley, it's wood, I think both protective and decorative. And keep this in mind as we get to our last school, Browningsville. This is, to my mind, the real heartbreaker. This was Browningsville back in the day, a gorgeous school. Started as a one-room school, the windows were on the other side. The bell tower and a second room were added onto it. This is it today. Terrible condition, but still standing. It's privately owned. Go around back, you see the windows there. The roof caved in Snowmageddon 3 or 4 years ago now. As I said, privately owned. The owners would love to restore it. They don't have the money to do so, at least not right now. If you peek in one of those windows, probably hard to see here, there's the original chalkboard, and under the window is the wood wainscoting identical to what's in Kingsley. So those are the 28, and I've broken them down here by 1 and 2 rooms for white students, for African American students, what they're being used for today. There will be no quiz on that, but I do pose the question, could there be others? After all, it was just a week ago that I tracked down number 28. Well, at the base of Sugarloaf Mountain, just over the line in Frederick County, is the Halstead School. And the records show this was moved to this site. It was originally on the Montgomery-Frederick County line. It was administered jointly by the 2 counties for a while. You can imagine that that did not work out. But it's no longer standing in Montgomery County. My wife said if I changed the title of the presentation to Montgomery County Schools Still Standing, maybe I could count it. The 10 Mile Creek School, also you see there, Boyd's School. This was the Boyd's School for white students, literally across the tracks that run through Boyd's from the Boyd's Negro School. It was very near 10 Mile Creek. 10 Mile Creek was dammed up in the 1980s to form Little Seneca Lake. Other buildings were also submerged under the water, including the farm of Captain Boyd, for whom Boyd's is named. Captain Boyd, I should say, no S. If this building and the others have not rotted away by being underwater for several decades now, you could say, sorry, no pun intended, this might be a school of fish. Sorry.
We got it.
This is the Purdom Colored School. The only thing is, it's really a church, has always been a church. The Purdom Colored School met in this church building its entire life. It never, even though it was a public school, it never had a building of its own. So is it a school still standing or a church still standing? Some schools exist only in name. When Wayside Elementary was built in the late 1960s in Potomac, it took the name of a long-gone one-room school that had stood nearby. Snowfer School Road commemorates the school, exists today only by the road of the same name. The 1 and 2 room school era really came to an end because of school buses, late 1920s, early 30s. Of course, you could start to have what were called consolidated schools, larger schools, eventually with each grade in its own room. In Montgomery County, we can probably pinpoint the end of the era at 1928 when the Garrett Park School was built. That same year, Glen Echo Cabin John School was built. Two-story, very handsome, at least 6 rooms, maybe more. A similar brick building with a gorgeous entryway. This school later was renamed for Clara Barton, who lived nearby. It still stands as a community center. In the 1960s, this addition was put onto the front of the building, obliterating that gorgeous entry. I talk about this school because a report by a former Georgetown University architectural history professor singles out Clara Barton as representing the transformation of the Montgomery County School, the architecture, transforming it from the rural schoolhouse to the modern civic institution. And Dr. Alexis also notes that by this time, the Montgomery County schools were really a comprehensive modern school system with elementary schools and high schools all around the county. I mentioned the first high school was in Rockville. This was a later version of that school. This was built about 1906. In the 1920s, as I said, there were high schools all over the county. All pretty much looked the same, except of course for the Rockville Colored High School. These are very nice looking buildings. Unfortunately, none of these first generation high schools still exist today. But we do have the 28 one-room and two-room schools. And just to finish up with a little perspective on that number, here's a 1912 map about the heyday of those schools. You can count them up. They're just a little over 100 of these schools at the time in the county. So the 28 that are still standing are about a quarter of the ones that existed, which really is a nice survival rate, again, for such a suburban county. Of those 28, as we talked about, 8 were for African American students. And 8 of the 28, that's about 30%, and that's about the ratio of white schools to black schools at the time. Of those 8 black schools, as I said, 5 surviving were Rosenwald schools. 15 Rosenwald schools were built in Montgomery County, so that's a survival rate of 33%. And that's about double the survival rate of these schools that, as I said, were built all over the South. The schools have been lost or are deteriorating to such an extent that the National Trust for Historic Preservation a few years ago put Rosenwald schools as a group on their list of endangered sites. And here we are up in Maryland and Montgomery County, the northern reach of these schools, I think with almost a unique, interesting story to tell about them. Again, we have the publicly owned Norbeck Community Center, Old Norbeck School. And indeed, just a year or so ago, thanks largely to the parks and Jamie Coons, who spoke this morning on Josiah Henson, it was recently added to the Montgomery County Master Plan for Historic Preservation. That's the county equivalent of the National Register. Also still publicly owned is the garage up in Poolsville. Could either of these 2 buildings be restored to their former glory? It's been done in neighboring Prince George's County. This is the Ridgely Rosenwald School in Capitol Heights, saved from being used as a school storage facility to an absolutely authentic restoration, both outside and in. And on the wall is a photograph of Julius Rosenwald, which was the case when it was used as a school. Not that Julius Rosenwald required that his photograph be up there, but the communities were so grateful that was often the case. I'll close just with some credits for the story of the history of black schools in Montgomery County. A very detailed book by Nina Clark and Lillian Brown, who are to be saluted. Both were teachers in the segregated schools. Lillian Brown has passed away. Nina Clark is in her 90s and a true county treasure. Both of these educators were some of the first black principals of integrated schools in Montgomery County. Nina Clark, by the way, is the daughter-in-law of Noah Clark, the advocate of a high school for African American kids. Another excellent book, Warwick Hill's book on the segregated high schools. He was both a student and later a teacher in the schools. The history of Montgomery County schools up until 1965 was written by a former teacher, Guy Jewell, a very good book. And I relied on a lot of documents of the Maryland Historical Trust, and many of those documents were compiled by Eileen McGuckian, as well as probably some other people here. I'll just leave this slide up during questions. These are the schools that are open today and when they're open. So please do go visit. Questions, but if I could ask the first question, just a show of hands. Did anyone here attend a one-room school? It's not beyond the realm of possibility.
Two-room school.
Two-room school, okay, still counts. Very good. And what about anyone's parents? Yes. So, any questions about these wonderful schools? Yes.
I can imagine for the one-room and two-room schools, were all schools, all public schools co-ed?
Yes. As far as I know. As from the time of free public education, 1860s on. Before 1860s, you had private academies around the county, and the Rockville Academy still exists. And they may have been boys only. There may have been some girls' schools. I don't know of any. Yes, sir.
A comment. My daughter attended a two-room school in Washington Grove. It's since been torn down in place.
Yes.
She referred to it as Corn Cob College.
Corn Cob College. Of course, I was focusing on only the ones that are still standing, but yeah, there are, as I said, probably 100 that once existed around the county.
There is another one-room schoolhouse in Goshen, and it was in its original state for until about 12 years ago. I think it's on Goshen School Road, and now it's attached to a new house.
But it's still there.
Yes.
It's on Goshen School Road. I'll be checking it out. Thank you. One of my concerns was that there could still be some structures somehow lurking around the county. Thank you.
Your pictures. Your statement about the District of Columbia prohibiting students from Maryland attending during World War II, that was not true. If your parents worked for the federal government or were in the military, you could go to school in the district. And I, in fact, went to Coolidge, and I lived in Silver Spring. A number of my friends went to Central High School which at the time was the big business high school. And they did, we didn't, well, I assure you, we didn't pay for it.
Yes, and DC schools were an excellent system. My mother was a Washington native, and she graduated from Eastern High School, and very proud of having attended the DC schools. Central High School that you mentioned is an absolutely gorgeous building. Today it's Cardozo.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Hi, I wonder if a building on Forest Glen Road isn't a former single-room schoolhouse. It's across from the cemetery at St. John Evangelist. It fits all of the criteria. It's in
Forest Glen Chapel.
It's a church. Not one.
Okay, St. John Evangelist on Forest Glen Road.
It's a
It's
chapel.
across from the cemetery.
Yeah, yeah, it is.
It's a chapel.
Rebuilt chapel.
Well, the chapel, there's a small chapel replica tucked in the cemetery, but across the road is a building that looks smaller.
I'll check it out, thank you. Any others? Any other questions?
I have a question.
Yes?
Do realtors have mentioned when these houses that are former schools come on the market, they were former schools?
Yes, they do. That's right. I was going to try to go back to the Garrett Park School. That's another thing that got me going. When the Garrett Park School, the one-room school, was on the market, there was a feature story in the real estate section of the Washington Post, and I said courtesy of Washington Post for one of those photographs. There was a feature that was the old Garrett Park one-room school, and that was another thing that got me going on this. I didn't get to the open house at that, though. I wanted to go see it. So yes, they do sometimes play up the history of them. All right, thank you.